It seems that over and over we've heard the same things from Christian groups. They were very moved by this film. Many thought that it was tough to sit through all the violence, but it was personal for them. They really wanted to experience, as Mel Gibson depicts, what Jesus Christ went through leading up to his crucifixion. Now is the test to see how general audiences will react. Will they come to this film? Will this spark a national discussion about Jesus Christ? We'll know very soon.
I don't remember the first time I heard about the Passion of the Christ, but it was probably from my grandmother. She was a very religious woman, and the marketing for the film was heavily targeting Christian audiences. But Passion of the Christ wasn't just any run-of-the-mill Christian film. It was helmed by a bona fide movie star, not a washed-up TV actor. It's hard to imagine what made Mel Gibson make this film. The last film he directed before Passion was almost a decade earlier with Braveheart. Clearly, he has an affinity for period pieces. Almost all his filmography as a director is a period piece. But none of his acting work that I'm aware of would suggest that he would create the biggest Christian film since the Ten Commandments. I mean, before Passion of the Christ was released, the last film he acted in was The Singing Detective. But if you followed his personal life in the 90s, if you were aware of his strong religious background and conservative beliefs, maybe it wouldn't have been such a surprise. I was 13 years old when I went to see Passion of the Christ in theaters in 2004, and it was a very big deal.
The faithful are flocking to this theater this morning. The Passion is playing on all 20 screens. Now, this Metroplex has the feel and look of a crowded theater on a Saturday evening, but it's early Ash Wednesday morning. These are church members coming not for entertainment, but for inspiration.
My entire family was there at our local theater. My sisters, my mother, my aunt, and, of course, my grandmother, along with the rest of our church. A big part of the film's success was marketing to churches who would encourage their whole congregation to get out and see the film and bring the whole family along to see just how passionate Jesus was. That night, the theater was packed. The audience was buzzing. It's difficult to describe how big a deal it was. It was kind of like opening night of Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. The only difference was that the rabid fans of those fantasy series knew that what they were watching was purely a work of fiction. But for me and my family and the rest of the people there that night, the Passion of the Christ was very real. Despite being a Christian, I wasn't thrilled to see the film. I don't think I would describe my faith as rock solid at any point, but I believe that Jesus was the Son of God and that he died for my sins. I suppose you could say that I was raised as a Christian, but I wouldn't say I was indoctrinated. I believed in Jesus in the same way I believed in Santa Claus. My mom told me he was real, and I had no reason to doubt her. But it wasn't as if Christianity was some really big deal to me. I didn't actively identify as a Christian. It's just something I was by default. Throughout my life, the churches my family and I attended were of varying denominations. My mother wasn't terribly particular, as our beliefs weren't terribly dogmatic. We exemplified a sort of all-American free-range Protestantism. A Christianity of take what you want and leave the rest. And what I took was very simple. Jesus was a heroic, powerful figure who stood up for the weak and sacrificed his life to save ours. He was very similar to my favorite superhero as a kid, Captain America. To be Christ-like to me meant to care about other people and stand up for what's right. As a child, I had an on-again, off-again relationship with church, partly because of a lack of roots in any particular town. My family moved a lot. When I was about 12, we started attending church regularly again. We went to a hip, non-denominational church. You know the kind. The ones that begin every sermon singing worship songs with a rock band. But my family didn't go see Passion of the Christ with that church. We went with my grandma's church. A more evangelical crowd. I remember sitting in the theater, my mother seated to the right of me and my grandma to the right of her. I remember being slightly embarrassed to be seen with them. Going to see this Jesus movie was deeply uncool. But I loved movies, so I wasn't about to pass up going to the theater. The film begins with Jesus moaning and groaning outside in the middle of the night, clearly tortured. By what, I had no idea. But some evil androgynous woman was there, taunting him, worms crawling out of her nose, a snake slithering from under her robes. As the film progressed, I realized at the time how so many aspects of the story of Jesus' life were unfamiliar to me. Partly because the Passion of the Christ is rooted in the more dogmatic Catholic traditions like the Stations of the Cross. The agony in the Garden of Gethsemane meant nothing to me. You're just thrown in and expected to understand what was going on. Instead of being hooked, I was immediately bored, regretting my decision this evening and so already feeling ungenerous towards the film. As it continues, we're introduced to a squad of fancy-looking old men. They are Jewish high priests, though I didn't understand the significance of that at the time. In fact, I don't think I made any distinction between the Jews or the Romans. Such was my ignorance of the period and setting. After being sold out by Judas, these high priests arrest Jesus and take him to Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, and ask that he be executed. Pilate's unconvinced that Jesus has committed so serious a crime, so ultimately orders that he be whipped instead. Jesus is brought to the whipping ground, and so begins what is probably the most infamous scene in the film. For 10 minutes, 10 solid minutes, we see Jesus first beaten by a cane, every whip and lash explicitly shown, if not reveled in. His body covered in lacerations and bruises, but a cane not being brutal enough, apparently, his torturers pick up a whip decorated with jagged pieces of metal they use to rip chunks of flesh from his body. I wasn't a sensitive teenager, but even I found it brutal to watch. And as this horrific display unfolded before me, my mind wandered to my grandmother. My grandmother, who abhorred any kind of violence. I mean, she wouldn't be caught dead watching an action movie or a horror movie. I look over at my grandma and she was paying rapt attention, completely captivated by what was going on screen. And something inside of me broke.
I'm overwhelmed. It's more than I could ever think about. I mean, I'm numb.
It's a great story. I think every Christian and non-Christian should see this movie.
Did you expect to have this reaction when you heard about the movie?
To have this reaction at all.
Our Lord died in that way for our sins.
Only religion had the power to force my grandmother to subject herself to something I knew she found disgusting. Only religion could lend this film the gravitas necessary to have my grandmother come to a movie theater and watch a hard R film that has half of its running time dedicated to a man being tortured to death. Only religion had the ability to wield so much power over my grandmother. I was deeply unsettled. I couldn't take it. I told my mother that I needed to leave for a moment, and I went outside to clear my head. But I didn't really know how to process my feelings. I knew I was unhappy, and I knew that something wasn't right with what was going on in that theater. It took me a while to calm down and come back in, but by the time I did, Jesus had already been crucified. My mother asked me if I was okay, and I told her I was fine. I think she thought that the violence had been too much for me. No one else in my family had noticed I was gone. After the film, I stopped going to church as often. I started to have more doubts. I read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. I watched videos of Christopher Hitchens dunking on Christians. I started to subscribe to all of the early YouTube skeptic channels, too many of which have moved on from anti-religion to anti-SJW content. Soon I realized that I had completely lost my faith. An exhilarating and scary feeling.
Now, you've got another film coming up, I hear, but it probably haven't started yet, called The Resurrection. It's a sequel to The Passion of the Christ. Is that true?
With Easter on my mind, and with rumors that Mel Gibson is working on a sequel, I thought it was time to finally revisit the film that had upset me so much so many years ago. As I started the film, I started to get a little nervous. What would my reaction be? The truth is, I found myself emotionally unaffected, and I enjoyed watching the film, which is not to say that I think the film is good. The Passion of the Christ is preaching to the choir. It's not even attempting to reach a secular audience, or tell a compelling story like the infinitely better Ten Commandments. Its goal is to preach a sermon, reinforce a story that many Christians have heard over and over again. A story that has a very specific structure, following the Stations of the Cross, which, if you're not familiar with, are a numbered series of canonical moments leading up to the crucifixion. They aren't terribly interesting. 3 of the 14 stations are just Jesus falling down. Stations 3, 7, and 9, if you're curious. So, of course, the film lingers on each and every time that Jesus falls to the ground.
That particular fall was almost like ballet. It was sort of a lyrical fall.
And it also explains why we're inexplicably introduced to random side characters who seem to have no relevance to the plot. Like some dude named Simon helping Jesus carry the cross, Station 5, or some lady named Veronica wiping Jesus' face with a cloth, Station 6. Who are these people and why do they matter? The film has no interest in telling you. You're already supposed to know. In this way, The Passion of the Christ is not meant to be a traditional narrative film, so much as a dramatization of everything you've already learned at church, just bloodier. A non-Christian going to see Passion is going to be just as confused as a non-Marvel fan going to watch Avengers Endgame. It's going to seem like utter nonsense. While there are a few nice things I can say about the film, like Jim Caviezel's very dedicated performance and the effectively brutal special effects, there are more than a few baffling choices. For a film that seems to invest so heavily in realism and authenticity, so much so that you have your actors speaking Aramaic and Latin, why cast someone like Jim Caviezel, a man of European descent, in the role of Jesus, a Middle Eastern man? I mean, the answer is pretty obvious to anyone who has seen any mainstream depiction of Jesus in the last 500 years, because Americans think of Jesus as a white man. Don Turner Trice in the Chicago Tribune writes, "I have doubts whether moviegoers would have believed as ardently or felt as transformed if Jesus looked more Middle Eastern or Hispanic or even Asian. A more ethnic-looking Jesus probably would have been too jarring or viewed as too much of a political statement to have been taken to heart." I think she's absolutely right. Hundreds of years of Eurocentric Christianity has transmuted Yeshua ben Yosef, a Middle Eastern Jew, into the all-American white boy Jesus Christ. That image of a fair-skinned Jesus is so ingrained in the American psyche that I'm sure the thought of hiring a non-white or even just darker-skinned man never even crossed Mel Gibson's mind. But for some reason, Caviezel's blue eyes were just a step too far, so they decided, instead of just giving him brown color contacts, that they would digitally recolor his eyes in every shot. And the result is absolutely god-awful. Embarrassingly bad. His eyes range from a bizarrely glowing brown to puke green to piss yellow, and at times seem to kind of expand onto the hair hanging in front of them. And then there's the anti-Semitism.
Are you anti-Semitic?
No, of course not.
When I first watched the film more than half my lifetime ago, I was completely blind to it. But now it's impossible for me to view the film and not recognize how differently Mel Gibson portrayed the good Jews like Jesus, his mother Mary, and Mary Magdalene, who is portrayed by Monica Bellucci, one of the most beautiful women in the world, compared to the bad Jews, like the Jewish elites who scheme and conspire to have his beautiful white Jesus murdered. And maybe you think Gibson wasn't trying to make the movie anti-Semitic. He was just telling a story that happened to be anti-Semitic. If you think that, you don't know Mel. In 2006, he was quoted as saying, "The Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world." In 2010, he called Winona Ryder an oven dodger. And in 2013, he downplayed the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust in an interview with Reader's Digest. And that isn't even touching on his bigotry towards black people or the LGBT community.
And if you get raped by a pack of niggers, it'll be your fault. All right?
These aren't isolated incidents.
To be racist in any form, to be anti-Semitic, is a sin.
A few years after the film was originally released, a few years after I walked out of that theater, after I stopped calling myself a Christian, but before I called myself an atheist, I confessed to my grandmother that I had doubts about my faith. I was nervous. I was worried she would freak out at me or start to cry, fearing for my immortal soul. But instead she just smiled and told me, "You're agnostic, and that's okay. You'll figure things out." I'm sure she meant that I'd realized that Christianity was the correct path and that my faith would somehow ultimately be restored. She would pass away a few years later, but my faith never was restored. I've only grown more confident in my belief that there is no afterlife, that there is no supernatural force guiding and judging our lives. But she was right. I did figure things out, with the kindness and understanding and love from my troubled and wonderful family, and not because of Christianity, but in spite of it. Happy Easter.